Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to our channel, True Courtroom Stories. Today, we're digging into some amazing material based on the research of Mr. Zahir Ahmad Mir. What if I told you that the playbook for taking down a corrupt modern leader wasn't written last year or even last century, but in the 11th century? It sounds crazy, but stick with me because this ancient guide to justice is more relevant today than ever. Let's get into it. So let's start with a huge question, one that every society has to deal with. When the people in charge, the most powerful people in the country, break the rules, how do you actually stop them? How do you hold them accountable? It feels like a very modern problem, right? But the blueprint for the solution is, believe it or not, nearly 1,000 years old. Think about this for a second. Back in 2017, the highest courts in both South Korea and Pakistan did something that felt almost impossible. They actually removed their sitting leaders from office for corruption. Just incredible. But what's even more wild is that the legal framework they used, well, it wasn't new at all. In fact, it's a direct echo of a guide written almost a millennium ago. I mean, these were landmark events. The impeachment of a South Korean president, the disqualification of a Pakistani prime minister. These cases prove that judicial systems really can hold the powerful to account. But the core principles they relied on didn't just appear out of nowhere. To really understand where they came from, we've got to jump in our time machine and go way, way back. Okay, so our story takes us to the 11th century Seljuk Empire. Now, this was a major world power, a huge empire stretching all the way from Central Asia to the Mediterranean. And at the very heart of its government, pulling the strings, was one man, the Grand Vizier Nizam al-Mulk. He wasn't the king, but you better believe he was the architect of the empire's power, its stability, its everything. And he wrote all of his wisdom down in this masterpiece called the Siyasat-Nama, which means the Book of Governance. Now, this wasn't some dusty philosophical text. No way. This was a practical, hands-on manual for a ruler on how to build a state that was both just and strong. And his most radical ideas were all about one thing: crushing corruption. And here's where he completely changes the game. For Nizam al-Mulk, corruption wasn't just a crime of greed, a moral slip-up. He saw it as something way more dangerous. He believed it was a direct threat to the very survival of the state. He didn't see corruption as theft. He saw it as treason. His logic was actually pretty simple and totally brilliant. An enemy army, he argued, attacks you from the outside, but corruption, that rots an empire from the inside out. It destroys public trust, it hollows out your institutions, and eventually it leads to total collapse. So for him, fighting corruption wasn't just about being ethical, it was a matter of national security. But here's the thing. Nizam al-Mulk didn't just stop with the powerful idea. He was a practical guy, an administrator. He knew you couldn't fight a huge systemic problem with just words. You needed a system. You needed tools. So he built a whole toolkit to enforce accountability at every single level of his government. And get this, just listen to how modern this toolkit sounds. First, he created specialized anti-corruption courts, so cases weren't handled by officials who might be biased. Second, he made financial disclosures mandatory, forcing leaders to be totally transparent about their wealth. Third, he used surprise audits, so nobody could ever get too comfortable or think they could hide something. Fourth, and this one is absolutely crucial, he protected whistleblowers, encouraging everyday people to report wrongdoing without being afraid. And finally, he made sure the penalties were severe, making the risk of getting caught way, way bigger than any reward. This was a complete, multi-layered defense against decay. Now, for centuries, these ideas were studied, they were tweaked, they were used in different ways by different empires and legal systems. They never really went away. They became part of the deep DNA of what we think of as good governance. And that brings us right back to where we started, 2017. This right here is where the past and present just slam into each other. The Seljuk model was built on two pillars: independent officers who could investigate anyone, and severe penalties for abusing your power. Now look at the modern equivalent. What is it? A Supreme Court with the power to impeach and the ability to disqualify leaders from ever holding office again. It is the exact same logic, an independent body with the power to bring real, meaningful consequences, just separated by 1,000 years. It just goes to show you that the fundamental technology of governance, the core ideas for keeping power in check, it's remarkably timeless. The need for independent review and serious consequences is just as vital today in a modern capital as it was in the 11th century. And that leaves us with one last really fascinating question to think about. Nizam al-Mulk gave us this blueprint 1,000 years ago. We know what works. So why, in so many places all over the world, does actually putting it into practice still feel so revolutionary? It seems the real challenge isn't figuring out what to do, but finding the courage and the political will to actually do it. And that's something worth thinking about. Hey, thanks for watching. Please subscribe to our channel, give this video a like, and share it with your friends. We'll see you next time. It's pretty wild to think that a legal idea from centuries ago could still be shaking things up and holding modern leaders accountable. Well, today we're going to dig into just that, drawing from some fascinating research in True Courtroom Stories by Mr. Zahir Ahmad Mir. We're going to explore this really fundamental idea about what power truly is. And this really boils down to one central question, doesn't it? Is a position of public power something you get to own, like a house or a car? Or is it something else entirely? Something, more sacred, a trust that's been given to you to guard for everyone else. Let's see what history has to say about that. All right, let's jump in our time machine for a second. We're going way, way back, long before we had modern courts or constitutions. You're about to see how a really core idea of justice was already in full swing centuries and centuries ago. Okay, so here's the scene. You've got this governor over in the region of Balkh, and he is in some serious trouble. He's being accused of some pretty awful stuff, crimes against the very people he was supposed to be serving. And the charges, they were crystal clear: extortion, bribery, and just making up his own illegal taxes. I mean, this is like the textbook definition of abusing your power. So what happens next? Well, the response from the guy in charge, Nizam al-Mulk, it wasn't some chaotic mess. No, it was super methodical. Just look at this clear three-step process. Step 1, boom, immediate suspension. Step 2, a proper judicial inquiry. And Step 3, they confiscated all the wealth he'd gotten illegally. This is an early but really effective system of justice at work. And this is what came out of that whole inquiry. The judgment wasn't just about punishing one guy. It was this huge, profound declaration of principle. The ruler is custodian, not owner. Public wealth belongs to the people. Just let that sink in for a second. This isn't just about one corrupt governor, right? This is a massive, timeless statement about what power is supposed to be. Okay, now let's hit the fast forward button. We're jumping hundreds of years into the future, all the way to our modern world. The place is different. We're in South Korea 2017. But as you're about to see, the main problem? It's going to sound eerily familiar. So this time, we're talking about the impeachment of a president, Park Geun-hye. And just take a look at these charges. Corruption, abuse of office, violating her constitutional duty. Starting to see a pattern here? Yeah, the language is modern, but what she was actually accused of feels almost exactly the same as our ancient governor. And the outcome? It was swift and decisive. The highest court in South Korea ruled to kick her out of office. And get this, it was a unanimous decision. Everyone agreed. That word, unanimous, that's a huge deal. It's the entire judicial system sending a massive signal about just how serious this breach of public trust really was. And here's where it gets really interesting. This quote just perfectly sums up their ruling. See, the court didn't get bogged down in just legal jargon. They stated this foundational principle, and it's almost a perfect echo of what we heard centuries ago. Public office is a trust, not property. It's not something you own, it's something you owe to the people. Okay, so now it's time to connect the dots. Let's put these two stories right next to each other. I mean, yeah, they're separated by centuries, different cultures, totally different legal systems, but you're about to see that they are telling the exact same story about power and what it means to be responsible. Yeah, this table just lays it all out, doesn't it? It's crystal clear. Look at the accusations on the left, corruption and extortion. And on the right, corruption and abuse of office. It's basically the same thing. But the really amazing part, the most important part, is the principle behind the verdict. One calls the ruler a custodian. The other says the office is a trust. They're two different words, but they mean the exact same thing. You don't own it. You're just taking care of it for the real owners, the people. Just listen to that ancient ruling again. The ruler is custodian, not owner. Public wealth belongs to the people. Those words just have so much weight, a caretaker, a guardian, not an owner. And now, listen to the modern one. Public office is a trust, not property. It's the same exact idea, just dressed up for our modern constitutional world. The similarity is just incredible, and it shows that there's this profound, universal standard for what it means to be a leader. Okay, so what's the big takeaway from all this? Why has this idea, this custodianship of power, stuck around for so many centuries? And maybe the most important question of all, what does it actually mean for us, right here, right now? Well, here's what it all boils down to. First, the idea that power is a public trust isn't new. It's a timeless, universal standard. Second, holding leaders accountable, that's not some modern invention either. People have been fighting for this for centuries. Third, this whole idea gives us a really powerful tool for judging our leaders today. We can ask ourselves, are they acting like custodians or are they acting like owners? And finally, and this is the most empowering part of all, we, the citizens, are the true owners of public wealth and power. At the end of the day, leaders work for us. And so that leaves us with one last really big question to chew on. We've seen this principle pop up again and again in ancient times and in our own. So the question for you, for me, for all of us is, how do we, as the true owners, make sure our leaders are actually held to this timeless standard today?
All right, today we're diving into a really powerful story about accountability, and it comes from the book True Courtroom Stories by Zahir Ahmed Mir. We're going to look at a moment that absolutely sent shockwaves through a nation's political system. And it all circles back to one huge question, one that really gets to the heart of how a democracy is supposed to work. Who holds our leaders accountable?
So get this. In 2017, the Supreme Court of Pakistan did something almost unheard of. They removed a sitting elected prime minister from his job. Just let that sink in for a second. This isn't some historical event from centuries ago. It happened. And you've got to wonder, how on earth does something like that even come to pass?
So, let's break it down. This wasn't some kind of political move or a behind-the-scenes power play. Nope, this was a legal judgment, and a massive one at that. We're going to unpack exactly what the court said to understand the legal ground they stood on to make such a historic decision.
And that is the million-dollar question, right? A decision this huge can't just come out of nowhere. It has to be built on something solid, something real in the law. So, what were the specific reasons the Supreme Court gave for taking such an incredible step?
Okay, here they are. The whole case rested on these three pillars. First up, concealment of assets. Basically, not being upfront about what you own. Second, and this is a big one, a breach of trust. That strikes right at the core of the relationship between a leader and the people they serve. And third, a lack of honesty, which was specifically tied to a very powerful clause in the country's constitution, Article 62(1)(f). This article says that people in public office have to be, and I'm quoting here, sadiq and amin, which means truthful and trustworthy. The key thing to see here is that the court wasn't just giving an opinion, it was grounding its entire decision right in the text of the Constitution.
Now, here's where it gets really interesting. The court's ruling actually went way beyond just this one person's actions. The judges took this opportunity to lay down a really powerful, lasting principle for how anyone who governs should behave. It was a message for the future.
Before we hear the court's own words, it's helpful to know this little bit of legal lingo, ratio decidendi. It's a Latin phrase, and all it really means is the reason for the decision. Think of it like this. It's not just a side comment, it's the absolute central pillar of the judgment. It's the core legal idea that becomes the precedent for all future cases. And the ratio decidendi in this case, well, it was a big one.
And here's the first part of that core principle. Those who govern must be beyond suspicion. Wow, just think about that for a second. The court is setting an incredibly high standard here. It's saying it's not enough to just be technically not guilty. For the system to work, for people to have faith, leaders have to be seen to be honest. No shadows, no doubts.
And here's the other piece of the puzzle. The court framed corruption as something more than just a crime. They saw it as a direct assault on the very foundations of the state. And what's the fix? What's the antidote? Accountability. So in their view, this decision wasn't just about punishing one person, it was an act of repair, of restoring and strengthening the entire constitutional system.
So, when you put it all together, the disqualification, the legal reasons, the high-minded principles, what's the big lesson we can pull from this whole story? It really comes down to this timeless push and pull between two major ideas.
And here it is. Power is temporary. Responsibility is permanent. You know, holding an office, having a title, wielding authority, all of that eventually comes to an end. But the responsibility you have to be honest, to uphold the law, and to keep the public's trust, that doesn't just go away.
This whole case is a pretty stark reminder that nobody, no matter how powerful, is above the very principles they swear an oath to protect.
And that brings us right back around to the big idea. We've seen what a Supreme Court-decided accountability looked like in this specific, high-stakes situation. But you know, this principle isn't just for courtrooms and constitutions. It applies everywhere, in our jobs, in our communities, even in our own lives. So, we'll leave you with this to chew on. In your world, what does true accountability really look like? Thanks for joining us.